Well, welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. I am Jodelle as usual, and I am happy once again to have Dr. Ray Peat with me here today. Dr. Ray Peat is officially my forever go-to source for all things nutrition and health, and he has a PhD in biology. He has taught at many renowned schools and universities regarding all things nutrition and women's health specifically. And you can learn more about him by visiting raypeat.com. That's raypeat.com. And you will be as inspired as I am today as we are talking about digestion. So, Dr. Peat, I'm so very honored to have you back on the podcast again. You are always so generous with your knowledge, and I wanted to pick your brain about digestion today and all the digestive distress that at least I have seen in my practice. And, from what I understand, digestion is one of the top 5 reasons people come to see their doctor. And also, in my practice, it's one of the top 5 reasons people give me a call, too. So I wanted to pick your brain. What do you think, or why do you think there's so much digestive distress in our modern society? And was it this bad 40 or 50 years ago?
One of the things that has been a general problem is the physical inactivity. Like people who live in apartments have to take their dogs out for a walk every day because the digestive system tends to slow down when you aren't walking. Mm-hmm. There are reflexes between especially the legs and the intestine, and in general, physical inactivity affects the whole process of appetite and digestion and elimination. But the change from a crude diet to a very refined diet was one of the factors. And around the beginning of the 20th century, there were health organizations that emphasized using whole grains rather than refined whole wheat flour rather than white flour, for mm-hmm. example, because of the bulk forming effect of the bran of the wheat. Mm-hmm. And people who have studied the difference between, for example, Africans and Americans found that because there was a lot of potato in the diet of the Africans and other fibrous foods, their transit time on average was about 12 hours from in to out. And the average American at the time the study was done had a transit time of 72 hours.
Oh my goodness.
A tremendous difference. And I noticed that the rising incidence of bowel cancer in America has been really huge. So I looked up the rate of the same kind of cancer in Africa, mm-hmm. and there's almost no colorectal cancer in the undeveloped parts of Africa where they still eat a fairly fibrous diet.
Mm. Well, you mentioned right at the first about people going for walks a lot more, or they used to walk a lot more. And now, do you think that a lot of our digestive distress is from a kind of a society of sitting?
Yeah, definitely. Everyone who takes up the habit of walking for an hour or so a day notices improved digestion. Mm-hmm. The general sense of well-being is largely because of the improved movement of the intestinal muscles, mm-hmm. but also improved secretions. The feeling good and relaxing and moving around reduces the nervous tension, and that increases the secretions. You can see it even in saliva. When you're very anxious, your mouth tends to go dry because of the shift from one part of the nervous nervous system to the other, shuts off secretions starting in the mouth, but affecting all the way down.
Yeah, so there is kind of a north to south process, right? So would you say that the saliva is just as important as the stomach acid? I mean, as it starts there and it works down to the stomach acid and then the CCK and all the different secretions that happen from the pancreas and the liver, like, is it pretty important to start with the fundamentals, like keeping a good cephalic head phase of digestion going as well as good adequate stomach acid?
Yeah. Anyone who has taken a drug that shuts down saliva production has generally had an outbreak of cavities. The anticholinergic drugs and some of the antihistamines reduce the production of saliva so much that it's not just the drying of the lower quantity of saliva, but the composition changes chemically, and instead of washing away and inactivating bacteria and their products, it tends to favor their growth. So you can see it as increased deposits on the teeth, but especially in the extremely fast development of cavities when the mouth is dry.
Isn't that fascinating that digestion even translates to teeth health? So I didn't even have any idea about that. I just assumed you were going to say something like the not having the adequate saliva would lead to poor digestion too, because they need that enzymatic breakdown in the mouth. So is that also the case?
There is a little that begins in the mouth, and 50 to 70 years ago, some people were getting sort of fanatical about having to chew your food so many times to make sure you liquefied it. But the quantity of enzymes in the saliva is not very great compared to some animals, and those same enzymes are secreted later in the stomach and intestine. So if you miss getting some of the digestion started in your mouth, your stomach can make up for it by secreting a lot of the starch breakdown enzymes too.
Okay, well, let's talk about that north to south process. So I've always been an advocate for adequate stomach acid for proper digestion. So what are your thoughts on the stomach acid itself and how we can keep it adequate?
That's another thing that's regulated strongly by the nerves and hormones. The ultimate source of the acidity is in oxidation and production of carbon dioxide, which then is involved in the secretion of hydrochloric acid. But it's a respiratory process essentially, and so if your thyroid is very low, your stomach acid is going to be low, and the muscles become weaker at the same time that the secretions are weaker, and so slowing down the transit time for various reasons, including inactivity. The slower transit gives time for abnormal, even yeast can develop at an extreme in the stomach when the acid is very low and the muscle contraction is very slow. Food can stay in the stomach so long that around 1955 or 60, there were some cases in the news of people who were thought to be drunkards because they always reeked of alcohol and were half drunk all the time. It turned out that they had a little brewery always going in their stomach and intestine. If they would eat carbohydrate, starch, for example, the enzymes, their own enzymes, could produce enough sugar that yeast could grow on it, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. And they can produce enough to make a person chronically a little drunk, but at the same time, the yeast is poisoning them. But there are different degrees short of that. When you look at the health, look at a big population like the U.S., where a high proportion aren't very healthy, and look at microorganisms at different points of the small intestine and stomach. A small percentage, maybe 10%, have a completely germ-free stomach and small intestine, sterile all the way down until it gets to the colon. And then a larger proportion, 30 or 40%, the lower half of the small intestine is fairly well infected. And then I think it's about another third of the population has detectable germs all the way up to around where the pancreatic enzymes get in. The enzymes have weakened to the extent that germs can survive right up to the area where the proteolytic and lipolytic enzymes are being secreted. So the slow transit and weak secretions allow organisms that sometimes can be pathogenic, and in general, they go with a reduced state of health. A very high proportion of the population suffers from having some degree of microorganism overgrowth between the stomach and the beginning of the colon. When they grow only in the colon, they're pretty harmless.
Yeah, I want to come back to those microorganisms because, as you know, there's a big movement of people advocating for all of these gut healing protocols with probiotics and prebiotics and stuff like that. So I want to come back to that. But as far as like going down the north to south process, so going through the stomach acid, now we come to like the liver and the gallbladder. I'm assuming the liver and gallbladder are pretty important to digestion too, but as I'm seeing, a lot of people have liver stagnation, and then a lot of people don't even have a gallbladder anymore. So can you talk about the importance of making sure that even if you don't have a gallbladder, how important it is to keep your liver functioning well?
Yeah, the liver absorbs nutrients, and along with the nutrients will come the toxins, especially if you have bacteria growing with the digesting food where they shouldn't be. They're necessarily going to produce toxins that will burden your liver. So one of the first things that goes wrong when your digestion slows and the bacteria and yeast start growing where they shouldn't is that the high endotoxin will start slowing down your liver function and swamping the ability of the liver to detoxify and excrete these toxins. That's where even if a person is sedentary, if they eat enough fiber, the fiber is going to bind and move along some of the bacteria, and in the process of a bulk of fiber moving through you, the fiber reduces the absorption of endotoxin, and one of the functions of the liver, besides detoxifying endotoxin, is to keep the level of hormones under control. Your glands increase the amount of hormone in your blood. The liver decreases it by attaching sulfuric acid or glucuronic acid to the molecule, making it water soluble so that it can leave in your kidneys. But some of it is excreted into the bile, especially if you're overloading the excretion glucuronidation process. then these hormones like estrogen are coming out in the bile, and they will be reabsorbed and give you a chronic excess of circulating estrogen if your liver slows down, and that can be to some extent overcome by making sure that you're taking in fiber all the time to bind and move along both the endotoxin, the bacteria, and the excreted hormones such as estrogen and cortisol.
Yeah, and in a little bit I want to touch on exactly what some fiber foods are that you would recommend for healthy digestion. But also, can you explain, like in really layman's terms for people to understand endotoxin? How would you explain that?
Its chemical name is lipopolysaccharide. It's a group of fatty acids attached to a carbohydrate that has something analogous to a soaping action physically, that the fat is absorbed into cells and it drags in this carbohydrate that acts as an irritant, and cells are basically irritated and inflamed when they absorb it, and the gallbladder, every tissue is damaged by endotoxin, but the gallbladder receiving the chemicals estrogen and endotoxin, for example, that haven't been completely detoxified, the system leading up to the gallbladder and the muscle and duct leading out of the gallbladder becoming inflamed, and this will show up, for example, in pregnancy if estrogen is extremely high. The cholesterol will tend to accumulate there, and the bile becomes abnormal, tends to precipitate cholesterol and a variety of chemicals that form sludge or stones in the gallbladder at the same time that the endotoxin is weakening the contractile function of the gallbladder, but the estrogen, besides creating that tendency to be unable to excrete, it can cause a spasm of the duct leading out of the gallbladder, and that can bring on a crisis in which a stone might not be able to be expelled, or the bile can accumulate and just build up pressure. Thyroid deficiency is extremely closely associated to gallbladder problems because of the lowered detoxifying function of the liver when the thyroid is low. And so I think without exception, the people that I've known who've had gallbladder disease, especially surgery, were extremely hypothyroid chronically. And that usually goes with too much estrogen that can cause spasms anywhere in the smooth muscles, starting with the gallbladder and the duct, but even the small intestine. In X-ray studies, they've given a big dose of estrogen, and they can see the small intestine going into a cramp, so it blocks the duct out of the gallbladder, or it can cause spasms anywhere along the line. And when you get into that overexcited, under-energized state of the smooth muscle of the intestine, a local irritation can send out waves of contraction, and it can go backwards especially during sleep, when the nervous system is relaxing, irritation way down the small intestine, it can go into spasm, not allow passage, and instead a wave will head north from the spastic block in the intestine, and it can cause regurgitation, irritation of the esophagus, and lots of people wake up with a bad taste in their mouth. That's often because of reverse peristalsis.
Wow.
An enterologist who had medical students to experiment on put microscopic particles that could be easily identified, club moss spores, and had them put it into their rectums in the afternoon, and then in the morning they took swabs from their mouth, and those who regularly had morning breath found that the spores could be identified in their saliva, showing that it's extremely common to have reverse peristalsis all the way from the rectum to the mouth during the night.
Wow. You also were talking about how the gut can go spastic, as well as the, I think you mentioned something else about endotoxins. There was another symptom you had mentioned, but what are some of the digestive symptoms someone might experience if they have a high level of endotoxins?
When the intestine gets in trouble, the symptoms can be throughout the whole body, because when the energy is low, permeability is high. In other words, the blood vessels leak in the wall of the intestine, and what should be absorbed as digested food going into the lymphatic system to be processed by the liver as nutrients, instead of going the proper route, all of the blood vessels in the intestine become overpermeable, and the toxins then get into your general circulation. So when the intestine is in bad shape, the so-called leaky intestine is letting the toxin go straight to your brain and heart and lungs. So it can contribute to symptoms like obstructive pulmonary disease, emphysema, shock-like symptoms, just poor lung function in general, reduced heart function, heart failure, various insomnia, the sleep apnea. All of these things involve endotoxin poisoning as a rule.
Those are some huge, that really tells us that there's so much correlated with endotoxin when you lay out that list. What about some lesser known symptoms? Like would gas and bloating for someone be, and that's a clear-cut issue that they've got some endotoxins going on, or things?
The gas and bloating, if you tap on your belly and it sounds like a drum, that's the accumulation of gas. And if the muscle tone is proper, as gas forms, it should be constantly released a little bit at a time. But when you're in that spastic state, the sphincters don't let it out, the peristalsis doesn't move it along, and so it forms great balloons of gas that can cause pain, and that pressure in itself can, for example, cause migraine. The same enterologist that I mentioned before, experimenting on his medical students, at the time, they were shifting the paradigm. In 19th century, everyone believed that the intestine was a source of toxins, very well-based scientifically, but around 1910 to 1920, the medical industry was being modernized, and they wanted to get away from all of the traditional food can be your medicine. They wanted to throw away that concept, and so they suppressed the idea of self-intoxication from the intestine, and did various things to argue that it's nothing but pressure, not toxicity. And so what Walter Alvarez, the professor, did was to insert big wads of cotton into the rectums of his medical students in the afternoon. And when they came back, those of them who had a susceptibility to headaches and migraines, they all had a headache brought on just by the pressure of cotton in their rectum. He said, see, it isn't autotoxicity, it's just pressure from not moving the bowels often enough. So he, in a way, was blaming it on behavior rather than on the nature of the food and digestive process.
Do you think that anxiety has anything to do with endotoxin or gut distress? I mean, you hear the whole gut-brain connection. So what do you feel about the anxiety?
It goes both ways. The absorption of toxins, they have fed different kinds of fiber to experimental animals, rats in particular, and found that type of fiber, soluble fiber, that feeds bacteria, that's the kind that's being recommended by a lot of companies as a prebiotic feeding bacteria. But in the rats, they found that soluble fiber increased their fearfulness and their aggression. Definite brain changes just from adding this one type of fiber feeding bacteria. But it can go the other way. If you have some kind of an emotional experience, the shift towards high sympathetic adrenaline activity takes the blood away from your digestive system, makes it available to your muscle system for the fight or flight reaction. But the intestine suffers oxygen and sugar deprivation meanwhile. And if that's continued, that energy deprivation leads to the increased permeability and absorption of toxins. So it can cause a chronic brain syndrome all the way to epilepsy. Animal experiments have shown that the combination of pressure and irritation and hypoglycemia is enough to bring on epileptic seizures in animals. But short of that, you will experience mood changes, aggression, fearfulness, anxiety, and so on from different lower degrees of bloating and toxin absorption.
You mentioned with the cotton how it was kind of what they were calling the prebiotic fiber, and let's talk about that. What about probiotics? What about this trend where everybody's taking these megaspores and probiotics as well as eating prebiotic fiber? What do you think about that?
Animal experiments, when a doctor, Dennis Burkitt, showed that Africans were pretty free of bowel cancer because of eating fiber, that started a fiber craze. But instead of saying people should eat potatoes, which he was saying in Africa, Americans had waste cereal fiber to sell, bran, and so that started the craze of using oat bran as the fiber. And so people started doing research on oat bran happens to break down into bowel carcinogens, estrogenic fiber breakdown products. And so they compared a clean cellulose fiber, relatively wheat bran, didn't break down to the carcinogens the way the oat bran did. But the good thing about cellulose is that it's practically resistant to bacterial breakdown, so it functions only as fiber, stimulates peristalsis, cleans out, binds a lot of the estrogen and endotoxin. So it's very safe and usually effective. But what they're selling now, it's a very ornate bunch of assumptions building on the function of how it breaks down. They like to see the short chain fatty acids, which they concentrate on some local effects that seem to be protective to the intestine. But when you look at the systemic effects of these, lactic acid tends to go with butyric acid and propionic acid as products of the breakdown of these soluble fibers. And these contribute to the systemic problems as well as local damage to the intestine. So there's a huge amount of research, but it's very selective and in a limited context. I see it as a giant advertising industry supported by the food products manufacturers.
Yeah, and as far as like the probiotics that they're selling, do they have any benefit? Like, you know, you'll hear bifidus bacteria is a big one, and even in my early career, like I always thought that was the one that I wanted to help people with their digestion with, because 70% of our bacteria is made up of that, and it seemed like a lot of people were lacking it. So is there any benefit, or now I don't advocate for probiotics anymore because I don't understand the mechanism of adding bacteria in when we're in a world of bacteria. If we could just eat the proper foods like what you're saying, we can remedy some of this. So what are your thoughts?
The people who lose the safe type bacteria, well, first of all, the small intestine shouldn't be having any bacteria.
Right.
But the safer bacteria in the colon are competed against by the more irritating bacteria, and it's the bacteria which are present that establish a whole ecosystem. And even if you eat a yogurt type bacteria, a lot of them will not survive a healthy digestive system. The stomach and pancreas secretions will simply keep them from growing. But when they do get through and reach the colon, the existing bacteria will usually just suppress their growth. And so you need something which, along with the harmless bacteria like the lactobacillus, you need something that produces basically a competitive antibiotic that will give themselves the chance to compete against the more irritating bacteria. Years ago they were selling a product called Earth-based bacteria, I think, or Earth-derived bacteria. And that started in the Second World War. The Germans in North Africa noticed that indigenous people didn't suffer from dysentery, where their soldiers were all having terrible diarrhea. And they found that the remedy locally was to eat a little bit of camel dung. And so they looked at what was in the camel dung, and I think it was 3 main bacteria, and those were sold in American health food stores as these earth-based bacteria. And in the Ukraine and some Eastern European countries, that has continued. I tried one product called Biosporin, which was, I think, Bacillus subtilis, and Licheniformis, I think, was the other one. And they produce a very strong antibiotic. And at certain times of the year, unpasteurized cow's milk has a lot of these, which make the milk very extremely resistant to bacterial growth, which would be a good condition to have in your colon. In Grants Pass, when I was in school there, one of the dairies was proud of its raw milk, and there was no air conditioning in the county fair building during the summer, and so it was always hot where they displayed milk. His competitors' milk would go sour by the first afternoon, so they had to change their display because it would separate into a curd and green or yellow whey, and he kept his raw milk on display the whole week of the fair, and that can only be explained by the presence of antibiotic bacteria such as subtilis, which are natural when the cows are healthy and the milk isn't too pasteurized.
Yeah, and that's not one you hear about normally in any of the supplements. But you mentioned, since you mentioned camel dung, it got me thinking about, what about our poo? Like, is our poo like a marker of how our digestion is doing? Would you say that you can look at your poo and decide, do I have a lot of endotoxins? Am I doing okay? Like the structure of the poo itself?
Yeah, it should be basically of the color and odor as a baby's, and if it starts smelling rotten, usually you're feeling rotten, and getting that through you quickly is one of the functions of a good inert fiber, and the right kind of bacteria can survive your digestion, and living in your colon, it can simply act as an antibiotic to kill off those horrible rot-producing bacteria.
So let's talk about some of those fiber foods and maybe a food like that's an antibiotic type food that you recommend for someone to improve their digestion.
If you look at foods at plants that grow in a warm, moist, dark environment, which is like our intestine, to survive in that kind of a bacteria and fungus rich and supportive environment, they have to contain their intrinsic antibiotics. And root vegetables typically contain that sort of antibiotic. And if you the difference between a moist above ground vegetable like lettuce, I've experimented putting it in a room temperature or warmer place in a low oxygen environment like a bag, and then put a carrot in the same situation. After 3 days, or the usual transit time, the lettuce will be a rotten mess, and the carrot will still be almost like you put it in, showing that the carrot has a very powerful antibiotic system. So that got me started. on the carrot salad idea, if you shred a carrot finely and lengthwise so that you maximize the fibrous property of it, that's a physical binding agent that releases, as it travels along, slowly releases some of its antibiotic substances. But if you eat it with a little olive or coconut oil and a little vinegar, both of these saturated fats are bactericides or bacteriostats and fungicides. So you have three types of antibiotic substances in a pleasant-tasting salad. And doing that every day kept my intestine healthy for about 20 years. And I eventually wanted to branch out for something less boring, and I found that bamboo shoots, if they're well boiled, don't have any intrinsically harmful properties. A little bit of cyanide, but that's harmless in the slow absorption. But they contain quite a bit of antibiotic, anti-inflammatory effect, as well as lots of cellulose and very little of the type of material that could support bacterial growth. And well-cooked mushrooms are a very different kind of fiber that carries with it antibiotics and anti-inflammatory chemicals. And then for short use, well-cooked oat bran or wheat bran is fine for getting a temporary cleaning out. You just don't want to eat a lot of oat bran every day for 30 years because it does release that mild carcinogen.
What foods would they want to eliminate? Obviously, there's a lot that they could choose from, but what are some of the key foods someone would want to eliminate with digestive issues?
The things that are hard to digest, so all raw vegetables except for carrots, as far as I know. There were experiments early in the food industry in which they would make a selection of raw vegetables that were popular canned items in grocery stores, and then they would feed one group of rats nothing but those vegetables, and then another group of rats they would feed the exact choice of vegetables, but from cans, cooked at a high pressure and quick cooking to make them soft and tasty. And the rats that ate the canned vegetables thrived as long as the experiment went on. The ones on the raw vegetables couldn't digest them, got diarrhea, and wasted away with digestive problems. So raw vegetables are people often tolerate them, but they aren't really good for anyone.
Would you say like eliminating gluten would be another one people would want to do, like gluten-containing foods?
Oh yeah, all of the seed substances combine either protein and oil or protein and starch, and that combination is always hard on the digestion. When the protein is if you just grind the seed in its natural form, the protein is in a storage form in which the number of molecules is much smaller than the sprout will contain. The sprout uses those as growth substance before the plant develops the ability to make its own food. So it needs some way of concentrating the essential amino acid equivalents. They are not in the seed, but the atoms needed to make the essential amino acids are there. So if you eat the seed, a bean, for example, has supposedly a high percentage of protein, but it's the atoms that are needed to make a high-quality protein that you find in the bean or the cereal, rather than the protein itself. If you soak the seed to the point of sprouting, one experiment found that there was as much as 2.5 times more protein value for soaking a seed to the point of sprouting.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process of making those functional proteins, those resemble animal proteins to a great extent. But in the storage form, gluten is just one storage protein that has been famous for its irritating properties. These proteins that are designed for storage have to have a lot of ammonia stored in a bound form. Mm-hmm. So the lysine, for example, all of the amino acids with an amino side group, these are concentrated in the storage proteins, and then they're broken down, and the amine, the nitrogen, is released and resynthesized into different amino acids. Arginine, for example, is one of the potential irritants, and when we digest it, it can feed the increase of nitric oxide mm-hmm. that goes with irritated intestine from endotoxin. So a combination of bacteria and arginine from a grain or bean becomes multiply toxic and irritating. And the quality of protein is simply so low that some specialists have said you can't consider legumes and cereals as food proteins at all. They rank at 6% or so, where milk ranks at 70%, egg yolk at 100%. Mm. And on that scale, potatoes, at least of some varieties, rank at higher than 100% because they contain materials that can use the ammonia or nitrogen-containing groups that are waste in our bodies, recycle them and make them into essential amino acids. So the protein in potato equivalent is basically more than perfect.
That is so fascinating. I've heard you say that before, and I just think that's such an interesting thing you don't hear. As far as like advice you would give someone and supplements or lifestyle habits, what other advice would you give for someone who's looking to improve their digestion?
The setting of living in an interesting way, avoiding anxiety, is an essential thing. You don't want to eat while working on something anxiety provoking. You won't digest it properly, mm-hmm. And avoid the indigestible raw proteins and undercooked cereals, mm-hmm. And keep the nutrients in balance. The milk protein and other things in milk have non-food value. Milk is designed biologically to facilitate digestion and assimilation, both of the nutrients. So it's a very complex system of favoring the working of the intestine. For a long time, people investigating digestion have found different ways to study it. For example, Pavlov used a pouch into the stomach to watch what happens. The conditional reflex psychology grew out of his discovery of what happens in the stomach. He found that if the lab workers dressed in a certain way, it could disturb the dog's digestion. Unexpected things could delay their digestion by a long time. So he made it very clear that the setting in which you eat is a very crucial part to the whole process. And that's now being amplified to see that those changes occur all the way along your digestive system: saliva, stomach, gallbladder, pancreas, wall of the intestine, all the way down. Mood is very powerful.
Yeah, I think I could do a whole nother part 2 with you on this. I mean, digestion is just unbelievably related to good health. So I appreciate your time today. This has been wonderful, as usual. And could you just tell the listeners briefly about how they can get your newsletter? Because I think it's really important that people keep up with what you're putting out. Can you let them know how they can do that?
Yeah, if you email raypeatsnewsletter at gmail.com, you can get information on how to subscribe. It's by email. It's $28 for 12 bi-monthly issues. That's 2 years, 12 issues.
Yeah, and it's the least we can do for all of the wealth of knowledge you give to us so generously in these podcasts. So we really appreciate your time, and thank you. I hope that this gives people some insight on how to improve their digestion, because it seems to be very important. So thank you, Dr. Peat, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Hey out there, I'm about to drop one more bit of knowledge about why you should drop an F-bomb. So I have ripped open a packet of coconut oil here, but I'm not going to eat it. I am going to use it as a little natural moisturizer. So you know how when you travel you don't want to take a whole lot, especially nowadays they only let you take a carry-on. And maybe you're just going away for the weekend and you need some moisturizer, you need some sunscreen to take with you. Well, guess what? Coconut oil is kind of nature's sunscreen. So you pack one of these little bad boys with you, and not only can you eat it, but you can put it on your skin. And it's nature's best sunscreen because it's a natural way to protect from the sun in a low-grade way, so you can stay out all day, get a little color, but not get burned. Also, maybe after the gym you want to moisturize and then head to work, you can use this. Maybe you need to get a little dryness out of your hair. This is a wonderful way to saturate the hair and really soothe the hair. Pour it all over your head, let it sit with a shower cap for a couple hours, and then rinse it out and wash it, and you're gonna have really soft, silky hair. And your scalp will be soothed too. If you have kind of itchy scalp, coconut oil is great for that. There are so many great reasons to have a packet of coconut oil with you, not just for eating, but also for body and skincare purposes. Works great as a face oil and a body oil. So check out dropandfbomb.com and get some of these handy dandy little packets to keep with you. Even if you're not into eating it, you're going to find it really beneficial to just take on the go with you. Oh, also, you can use my code GETFIT, GETFIT, to save 20%. Thanks for watching.